The session objectives are to be aware of when it is appropriate to use interviews and focus groups, and to understand the key principles when undertaking interviews and focus groups. Quickly to recap on qualitative research. Qualitative research provides detail, richness and sensitivity to context, and it's appropriate if the aim is to understand meaning and to build theoretical explanations from participant understandings. This means that within interviews and focus groups, it's important to let the respondents speak and to probe for as much detail and richness as possible within their answers. When it comes to the suitability of qualitative research, it is particularly suitable when the research problem cannot be addressed with numerical findings. The problem is new and variables cannot be developed because it's not known what variables should be used. Also, if the research problem is not fully known, qualitative research is particularly suitable as it's possible to change and develop the questions which are asked throughout the research process, whereas within quantitative research, the research questions and the questions asked within a questionnaire are much more fixed. Research participants and the number of participants used within qualitative research is often not so crucial, but what is more important is the depth of the answers contained within the interviews and focus groups. And because probability sampling is not required, statistical generalization is not the goal, but rather the participants are selected based on their ability to provide the depth and richness of information regarding their contexts. So then, the question of how many interviews and focus groups emerges. Well, there is no definitive recommended sample size for interviews and qualitative research, but saturation is the most used criteria. Saturation occurs when no additional data is being found within the dataset, so the additional transcripts from interviews and focus groups is coming forward with the same findings and the same results. However, within the literature, as a guide, it's been suggested that graduate students should be encouraged to sample between 12 and 60 participants, with 30 being the mean. So there are three different types of interviews. These are structured interviews, semi-structured interviews, and open or unstructured interviews. Structured interviews are developed based on the principle the same questions are asked for all the participants. Whereas semi-structured interviews, an outline of the topic and issues are produced, but the order and wording of questions might vary across participants. This allows the respondents or interviewees to move through the topics in the way that suits them, and they can start to move on to questions which might be asked later in the interview, and therefore the interviewer can change the order which fits the narrative being built through the interview. Finally, open and unstructured interviews allow the freedom to move the conversation in any direction. This is particularly useful where the research question might be very general or open, and actually the interviewer doesn't necessarily know what the important topics are, and the discussion can be led by the respondent or interviewee who is telling the interviewer what they think is important. When it comes to interviewing, it is important to ask open, not closed questions. This is because closed questions do not allow this depth or richness which are the strengths of qualitative research. Also, it's important not to ask leading questions. This is particularly important in interviews which happen face to face, where the respondent or interviewee might feel they want to provide the answer that they feel that the interviewer wants, and therefore might provide false or inaccurate information because they want to please the interviewer. It's also important to minimise jargon in questions, and it's useful to funnel questions from the broad to narrow. So start off the interview with the more broad and general questions before narrowing down to the more focused questions. This also helps the respondent or interviewee to feel more relaxed in the interview by starting off with easier, broader questions. And then finally, consider using a catch-all question at the end. This is particularly useful in case there's anything you've missed, and it can allow the respondent or interviewee to add anything which might be useful for your research. When it comes to focus groups, these allow a wide varieties of views to emerge, because often they involve between 4 and 8 members, and the emphasis is on consensus or lack of consensus of views and opinions within the focus group, rather than collecting individual opinions, which is the goal of interviews. Here the researcher acts as a facilitator or moderator rather than an interviewer in focus groups. The goal is to allow relatively unstructured and free-flowing discussion amongst the focus group members, so it's useful for the researcher to stand back as a facilitator and moderator rather than continue to ask questions and probe. However, this requires the researcher to have a high level of skill to conduct this type of discussion successfully. It's all too easy to feel the need to direct the conversation and to probe answers, and it's harder to sit back and let the discussion emerge, which is the goal of focus groups. However, the facilitator and moderator needs to still ensure that the direction and discussion of the conversation is relevant to the topic of the focus group. So in conclusion, interviews and focus groups are the most common qualitative data collection methods. Interviews are often used to explore interviewees' views, opinions and beliefs, whereas focus groups are often used to explore where consensus of views, opinions and beliefs exist, and where there is not a consensus of views, opinions and beliefs. Within both interviews and focus groups, it's important that the researcher allows the voice of the respondents and interviewees to come through, because this is where the depth and the richness of data comes from.